Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's wild conversation with the Minnesota Justice Research Center. Katie Remington is here with us today. Before we get started, I do want to go over just a few of our webinar features. All attendees are currently on mute. If you have questions for our panelists, please type those into the question and answer box. If we need to restart this webinar for any reason, please check your email for a new link. And we are recording this session. We're here today with WILD, our Wanton Injustice Legal Detail. WILD's mission is to harness the collective power of Twin Cities Diversity and Practices membership to remedy systemic anti-Black racism in the Twin Cities by partnering with and amplifying the work of existing community organizations. I'm happy to introduce you to our moderator, Darnell Cage. Darnell Cage is an attorney at Faegre Drinker, Biddle and Reith. He is our immediate past co-chair of our Emerging Leaders Group, and he is a WILD project lead. Welcome, Darnell, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Liz. Good to be here. Shall we? And I am more than happy to introduce Katie Remington of the Minnesota Justice Research Center, who will be having a discussion with today. Hello, Katie. How's it going? Can you hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you great.
Okay, splendid. It's good to see you again, Katie. I hope everything's going well, and it looks like Justin is able to join us as well. Hello, Justin.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you, Darnell.
Good afternoon. It's good to see you. And so, really now, so we've had a brief introduction about WILD and what it is and what our mission is. And really how these conversations are driven by that mission, right? So the goal of our discussions really have been to interact with community leaders who are doing amazing work, and in particular, we've been focusing on WILD has six really focus areas, really, and one of them has to do with addressing racism in police departments. And so our last, I think the sum total of our WILD conversations to date have been on that topic. And so we continue that discussion here today with you all and the Minnesota Justice Research Center. But maybe Katie and Justin, if you can give us a brief introduction to yourselves and also sort of a brief introduction about the Minnesota Justice Research Center, and we can dive into more details after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hello, everyone. My name is Justin Terrell. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Justice Research Center. I'm really excited to be here with you all. I think the work that WILD is doing is very important, and we're excited to support these efforts and these conversations. The Minnesota Justice Research Center is a young nonprofit. We were founded in 2017. Our focus is on transforming the criminal legal system. We want to see a system that is more effective, more humane, and operates with the public's trust. Our focuses primarily are on, if people ask you what we do research, education, and policy development. I'll let Katie kind of break down our research efforts since she is our research director, and we are lucky to have her. But on the education and policy development, we just believe that if you identify shared values as they relate to the criminal legal system, and you do the education, you put data behind those values, you can develop policies that then start to change the very foundations and landscape of the criminal legal system, and that is our goal. And we take an approach that is focused on building bridges between people who disagree, who have different lived experiences, and we want to see folks come together because we believe we have more shared self-interest than we tend to give ourselves credit for. And so once again, I'm excited to be here with you all, and I'll have Katie introduce herself and talk about our amazing work.
Justin, and thanks so much, Terrell, and all of you for joining us. I'm Katie Remington Cunningham, and as Justin mentioned, I'm the research director at the Minnesota Justice Research Center. And my own background is actually in education more broadly. So I bring sort of an educator perspective, and most of the work that I've done, in addition to my research, is working directly with young people with system-involved youth in particular. And so working with young people and sort of keeping them at the center of our conversations and our work is really important for us. The research arm, so Justin talked about sort of the education and the policy work that we do. And the research kind of arm of our organization is obviously deeply intertwined with that. But essentially we sort of see our research work kind of in three parts. So we have our policy focused research. We're going to talk a little bit about our report, I think today, on white supremacy in policing. And that's a great example of some of the policy focused work that we've done. So really connecting to and trying to engage in spaces where policy conversations are happening and contribute evidence or sort of literature reviews, or in any way contribute sort of to the research to really move those conversations forward. We also have partnership and evaluation work. So working with community organizations and community members to really sort of strengthen their direct service work through research and evaluation. And then our last kind of bucket of research work that I'm most excited about, that I think really makes us a unique organization, is our sort of what we call our community-led research. So the work that we do is not just engaging community, but it's really being generated from community. So the kinds of questions, the values that Justin mentioned, like these are starting with community in Minnesota. So that community is a really diverse group of folks. And so we think very deeply about how do we do research, both sort of as an end goal to learn, but also as a sort of liberatory and participatory process to sort of engage with community and actually make change. So that's kind of how we think about the research work at the Justice Research Center.
Excellent. And so maybe let's talk more about the Minnesota Justice Research Center. Let's dive into maybe some of your approaches. I know you mentioned that really the genesis of a lot of the work that you do it starts with the community. It is the community, and you all aim to provide the research that the community is seeking for. And you've done a lot of reports in the past, right? And what we'll talk about in a lot more detail later is going to be your latest report, which is talks about trust in policing and the role of white supremacy there. But maybe give us an idea of what it looks like for maybe from your perspective, from a community member's perspective. How does one engage with the Minnesota Justice Research Center, and what has been some of the outcomes? What's some of the work that you've done to date, and what maybe are some of the things that you're looking forward to?
Absolutely, Katie, or should I say Dr. Cunningham? Should I? I'll take the lead on some of our past work, and then you can kind of talk about some of the projects we have moving right now. So once again, so I've been the executive director since September. So I'm somewhat new to this role. Katie's somewhat new to her role as well. But since I joined the Minnesota Justice Research Center, the first thing we did was we hosted a conference. So we have an annual conference that's called Reimagining Justice. And so we'll probably change the name next year, but because it's a pretty popular and commonly used phrase now. But we had one last year, and the last 2 years. And that conference is really a space where we bring together people directly impacted by the criminal legal system, researchers and academics, as well as advocates and people who are fighting for change, sometimes in the streets. And so, and this year, I was really proud of the conference we put on this year. And you can watch the videos on our website. We had John Powell from UC Berkeley, Othering and Belonging Institute keynote. The first day we heard from the governor, Mayor Fry, Mayor Carter, and Vice President of the Minneapolis City Council, Andrea Jenkins. And it was all virtual, so we recorded everything. But we also brought in conservative voices, people like Mark Levin, not the Mark Levin from Fox News, but another conservative Mark Levin from a group called Right on Crime, which is based out of Texas and associated with like Wayne LaPierre. But they full-throatedly support criminal legal system reforms. And so we brought in conservative voices like Mitch Pearlstein and others to talk about the need to transform the system. So that's one primary way to engage with our organization, is to come to our conference, to watch the conversations that we've been hosting. Recently, we've done a series on our most recent report. But also, and Katie can talk a little more about this, like we take on volunteers, not a ton because we don't have a ton of capacity. We hire research assistants and students who want to dig into really interesting topics as it relates to the criminal legal system. And ultimately, you know, and Dr. Cunningham can talk about this, is that we're building this community, this research advisory board that is really about leading community-based research. So our expectation with some of the projects we have right now that are cooking, that we find ourselves in community, you know, once COVID is over, amongst crowds of people, diverse crowds of people, talking about these issues, learning together, building together, and actually learning how to take action together. Katie, you wanna put some more on the meat on the bone there?
I think you covered it really well. I think the other sort of thought that I have, and this is a question that I always ask, you know, it's like, how can I get involved? How can I get engaged? And I think it's a tricky question, because it sort of depends on like what you bring to the space. So if you're, like Justin mentioned, I think if you're sort of curious, the best way for a lot of us to engage right now with the capacity that we have is just to continue to really learn as much as we can, right? So there's so many conversations in particular about the criminal legal system that are happening sort of in the ether, whether your space is Twitter or you're listening to NPR, or, you know, like, you may have sort of different conversations that you're hearing. And so I think what's really important, and what we strive to do, is to really understand, you know, what we know. So when I say the research, like, what do we know about these issues and what don't we know? And so, you know, we hope to sort of provide that education piece. So one way that I hope folks stay engaged and involved with us is just to sort of continue to listen and learn, and reach out to us with questions and that kind of thing. And then the other piece, you know, we feel so I think terms are important to describe. A term like community, you know, is a really big, broad one. What do we mean by community? What do we mean by our values? Whose are? And we feel quite strongly about, in particular with our community-led research, that research and the questions and the conversations are starting with those closest to the problem. So we really start and focus our research work in particular on folks who have deep involvement with the criminal legal system, whether that's through incarceration, whether that's through, you know, whether they're survivors of crime or of violence, whether they maybe work in a system. So we really sort of start to try to figure out how to have conversations about the justice system more broadly, and transforming it by actually most deeply engaging those closest to the issues, but then also expanding our work more broadly to researchers, to other scholars engaged in this work. As Justin mentioned, we really like to do a lot of collaborative work with folks at the university, or students, anyone interested kind of engaging, and then more broadly sort of system level allies. So if you're a lawyer and you know a lot about the law and you're interested in supporting our work, maybe one way you could help us is sort of, if we've got a research project going on, we've got a question about how does this work? You know, maybe you work in particular with bail or something like that sort of expertise is also a way that we sort of build our network and our community more broadly.
I would be remiss as a executive director if people ask how to get involved with us and I didn't just clearly say, make a donation, support our work. Financially, you know, as a research nonprofit, it's very difficult to fund research. And so if anyone on this call would like to make a donation to support our work, we'll, you know, it definitely pays off a lot to contribute to the work that we're doing. It's meaningful. We appreciate it, and we consider people as allies and somewhat like members who give us money. Like, we expect you to be connected and in relationship with us, that the research and the work we're doing reflects the values that folks have who support us. So.
And so maybe we can talk about some of that work. So I know that you all have several reports that have been released. Maybe you can just briefly sort of share a bit about those, and what I want to dive into post sort of that description is really your latest report in trust in policing and the role of white supremacy. But maybe let's talk about a bit about sort of the work that you've done, including that at a high level, and then maybe some of the things that are on tap or on queue that folks could maybe get involved in, and then we'll start to unpack that report about the latest report after that.
Justin, do you want to talk about past work?
Yeah, so some of our past work that's really exciting is really more of this policy focused research. So, for example, our fines and fees and driver's license suspensions in the state of Minnesota. Well, if you visit our website, you can see some of the data we've collected on that. And that data then has been used by coalition partners like the Second Chance Coalition and the Assets Building Coalition, who have been lobbying to pass a bill through the state legislature that would do away with fines and fees and driver's license suspensions. And it's getting a lot of momentum. Anna Odegaard is the lead advocate on that. And you can, on our website, there's a video called A Pound of Flesh, which is the name of a book by Dr. Alexis Harris, who presented with us and Anna to talk about the impact of monetary sanctions. So the idea that justice is connected to how much money you make, right? And so we not just like host the conversation and do the research, but we also work with the partners who are literally stalking the halls of the Capitol, building support from legislators to actually pass a bill. And right now, both of the bills on fines and fees and driver's license suspensions are making its way through the legislative process as they start to go into conference committee. And we expect those bills to pass this year. Now, anything can happen at the legislature. So, if you support these policies, make sure you call your legislator and make sure that they know that they have constituents who support these ideas. One thing we learned from that project, which is always interesting what you learn from these type of things, right? Is that the state was making the argument that, they make $3 million or something like that off of fines and fees and driver's license suspensions. And we know the impact of this, right? So if your license is suspended, you're on your way to work, you get pulled over. I mean, talk about getting pulled over in this week, right? And what that means. But, a lot of people get cased up with additional fines and additional fees that they can't pay. And then all of a sudden the license is suspended. So they either get caught driving dirty and then their car gets towed and all that stuff. And some of those practices have gone by the wayside. But, still it's a heavy burden for an individual to carry simply for not having their license up to date, right? And then there's the fees that you pay to get for your ticket, but then there's an additional fee to get your license reinstated. And sometimes people don't pay that, or if you pay it too late or on the day they say it's due, it's this really complicated process. And the state was making the argument that they were making about $3 million off of this thing. Turns out they're making less than $200,000 because nobody pays those fees. And so the argument our data was able to make the argument that, like, just do away with it. You're causing more harm than you are preventing. And I think that argument, once again, is building synergy across political differences, across regions, across, urban and rural. I think people, Black and white people really in Minnesota are like, yeah, we're kind of over this dynamic. And so that's one example. Obviously, and then just quickly, I'll just name, we did the research for the restoration of voting rights bill that is also at the Capitol and has been at the Capitol for 20 years almost. And then one thing we did this year on that bill is we actually, during the election cycle, were able to work with the ACLU to produce a list of, we did some research on court records to produce a list of people who have completed probation. So in Minnesota, you can't vote if you're on probation and living in community. Well, this year we worked with the ACLU to help them cut a list where they could contact eligible voters who are formerly on probation and were eligible to vote in the 2020 election. But you know, the reality is a lot of people don't think they can ever vote again once they have a criminal record, right? And so through our work, through our research, and being able to cut this list for the ACLU, they are able to contact voters who were formerly on probation and formerly disenfranchised, and we're able to encourage them to vote in this election cycle. We don't have the numbers yet on that project because the Secretary of State puts those numbers out in the spring. So we should be getting those numbers in the next month or so we can actually put a report together. But it's really powerful work, you know, that our research is able to translate into real action.
Yeah, and I'll just pick up on sort of in that vein. That was part of the impetus for the report that we're going to talk a little bit about in more depth on the role of white supremacy and trust in policing. And your question of sort of future work, I think, you know, we think of our future work as sort of falling into those three buckets that I described at the beginning. So kind of in the policy space, we're continuing actually. So our former research director, Dr. Rob Stewart, who's now at Maryland, is continuing some really important work with Dr. Chris Eugen, who's at Minnesota, on sort of this broader question of monetary sanctions and fines and fees. So that work is moving forward in really important ways. We are engaged in continuing conversations too with folks like Anna Odegaard, the Minnesota Asset Building Coalition, about how to, in fact, I got an email from her this morning. You know, there are conversations now about traffic stops. What data can you provide? And so we're sort of, you know, a lot of our policy focused work is like, here's a conversation that's happening. Where can you find data to support it? So it's sort of on the ground and rapidly evolving. In our partnership space, we've got some really exciting work that we're doing with the city of St. Paul. So they're evaluating a program that's called Beyond Backgrounds in partnership with Housing Link and Drama Place to support individuals who are returning from a period of incarceration in accessing housing. So a lot of times barriers, you know, the background itself can be a barrier to accessing housing in addition to other barriers. And so working actually directly with landlords to try to alleviate that as a barrier to housing. So we're working in partnership with them. We've got some exciting a really exciting project we're working on right now with Wilder Research, evaluating the state's response to the unrest following the killing of George Floyd last year. And so that's work that's happening really fast. We've been conducting some fascinating focus groups with community members and business owners, really to sort of understand perspectives. It's quite a time to conduct these focus groups as well with our current context. And so we're really trying, you know, we're sort of supporting the kind of community piece of that research and really holding these conversations. And we plan to move that work forward as well. So there's a lot happening in our partnership space, and sort of that's always evolving. And then our community-led research, like this is something that we're thinking really strategically about. So right now it's very much sort of in the design phase, but we're doing a lot of really important design work with community members, with formerly incarcerated individuals in particular, to sort of really figure out how do we do this well, rather than just diving into this work and bringing some folks into a room and trying to have a conversation and running a research project. And so that is sort of, that's all kind of unfolding over the course of the next year, I would say, just to try to sort of figure out what does our research advisory board looks like? How do we actually connect with and engage in those smaller research projects? So definitely stay tuned for that work moving forward.
A lot of very great and interesting topics, and very prevalent to what's going on in society, and especially right here in our backyard. And I think, you know, we'd be remiss not to talk. So this week we've had the Chauvin trial going on, and we've also had the killing of Dante Wright earlier this week. And so I think the topic, at least of policing, is top of mind for everyone here, and hoping to be able to shed some light on just maybe some areas that folks maybe have given thought to or haven't had much chance to, but really want to dive into some of the subject matter of your latest report, Trust in Policing, and the role of white supremacy. And so maybe for folks who haven't had the benefit of reading the report, maybe you can give us maybe just a background of what your approach was, maybe what some of the key takeaways were from the report. Yeah, maybe we can start there.
You want me to take that one, Justin? I think that probably makes sense. So basically our kind of background or the approach to the report, Justin and I actually were having a lot of conversations about policing more broadly, but about really sort of digging more deeply into how to, as we mentioned at the beginning, we think more sort of broadly about transforming the justice system. And so we're both sort of engaging in this quick, immediate policy work, but also the sort of like, what does it mean to transform a system of justice, a system of injustice in many cases? So we call it sort of the criminal legal system for a reason, because we feel like the criminal justice system is a bit of a misnomer since it's not serving justice in the ways that we hope it might. And so we had conversations about how do we engage in this broader sort of social conversation around policing, and a historical perspective we thought was extremely important, and thinking about the role of something like trust as a value. So exploring sort of conversations about value. We hear a lot, you hear a lot in the news and also sort of in scholarly work that there's this importance of trust and a lack of trust. And so we thought we needed to really dig in. So is trust even important? Why is there a lack of trust? And so we were just having beginning conversations about this in sort of early January. And then on January 6th with the insurrection at the Capitol, we both sort of looked at each other and we were like, now is absolutely the time to write about this. It feels like it was already the time, but this is really staring us in the face in ways that it maybe hasn't for a long time. And so we sort of our approach to this work was essentially to think of it sort of in my research world as kind of a lit review or a review of the evidence, but really to sort of dig up, what do we know? What have folks already done in this space? And how can we think about and learn what we already know and what we don't know and figure out how to push this work forward? So we sort of, the way that our report kind of is organized is we first talk about this idea of trust. What does the data show about the sort of levels of trust that exists across different communities towards policing as a profession? And so we pull from the data, we present and pull the data there. And then we dig into this sort of bigger and broader question of white supremacy. And we spend a little bit of our report essentially noting that this is a huge topic, and this is not just something we can sort of fix with a policy, but it's something that we need to start understanding, defining, explaining, talking about really explicitly. So I think even sometimes we're sort of missing the point when we use terms like alt-right, or we try to sort of talk about like what are the names of organizations today, and I think what we really need to do is call it by its name, understand and connect to the historical legacy of white supremacy, the origination of policing. So we sort of, we dig into that a bit in the report, and then we pull back out and we talk about more contemporary examples. And what we find, what the data shows us really, is that, of course, the sort of role more broadly and the instantiation of white supremacy in policing is not new, but we find that it's becoming more really emboldened in many ways. So a lot of the examples that we sort of drew from both evidence and basically individuals sort of discovering or stories unfolding are becoming in many ways, in some ways to me, and this is my white woman perspective, like stunning that this can exist, and yet we're still not doing anything about it. And so for us, we sort of drew that evidence out, and then we ended the report with some recommendations, essentially sort of four main ones, and let's see if I can remember them. Most importantly, we talked about talking about it. So we need to bring this topic, we need to call it by its name, we need policymakers and the public and folks to actually engage in sort of grappling with our history and the foundations of policing and how they're connected to white supremacy. We need to conduct more research. So, obviously a research organization is going to say this, but the reality is in policing in particular, we know so little, we have so little access to data. So much data is not collected. I mean, even when we say things like crime rates, the reality is what we know is we know the rate of folks who are arrested. We actually don't know the rate of crime, right? So when we think about like, oh, sort of like drug use, we can say something about folks who are arrested for drug use, but we don't know actually anything about drug use for, you know, the sort of college kids on the campus of Santa Cruz. Like I used to live in the Bay Area, right? So I think there's so little that we know about data sort of in the criminal legal system that is a really important space that we think needs to be sort of a black box that needs to be opened. And we need to, the third thing, and I'll see if I can remember the fourth, is we need to try to do something about it. So we talk a little bit about taking action. You know, that can look a lot of different ways, but a lot of times conversations start in theory and they stay high level and we don't actually give something a try. So if there's a policy that might actually address this, like why don't we bring it to the legislature? So Representative Frazier had a policy about white supremacist ideologies in policing here in Minnesota. This is the kind of thing we should do and we should support and move forward. And the fourth is, of course, then to evaluate what we do. So again, the researcher in me is we can't just try things. We must try them and determine whether or not they're working. You know, are they achieving the outcomes that we want? And I think we need to be willing to mess up. I think that's another sort of challenge of this kind of work is it's life and death work. It's really scary because for so many people, this is truly about their lives, being able to survive, to get into a car and drive to the store. And so we have to be bold and we have to try creative solutions. And then we have to make sure that we check ourselves and determine whether, you know, it's achieving the result that we want to do and be able to pivot in that space. So that's sort of, you know, we dig into all of those topics in the 20 pages in our report, but that's kind of the overview.
Excellent. So maybe we can talk about, so the report is out there. You've done it. You've made these suggestions. You've dug through the data, and you presumably had conversations and later things about it. So let's talk about the response and the reception. So who has the report been distributed to? Who have you heard from who's been responding to it, and sort of what have those responses been?
Yeah, so the report. So one thing to understand about the report is that the audience, you know, may seem to be like for the Black community, right? The Black community, however, it knows about this issue. It has a PhD in white supremacy because we're on the other end of it, right? We know how it looks, we know how it acts, we know how to navigate it, and we've adopted survival tactics as a community to navigate it. So the audience for the report is really law enforcement. And the response that I've gotten from law enforcement, that we've gotten from law enforcement, has been mixed. So there are some people who just see it as a purely political document, and they kind of just reject it because they think that we're just trying to do something political. That is not the case. And then there's folks in law enforcement who frankly think it's amazing. They think that it's long overdue and have expressed deep appreciation for us to start trying to sort of agitate this, if you will, this conversation. And you know, we quote the chair of the POST board, which is the Peace Officer Standards and Training Board that is responsible for licensing every peace officer in the state of Minnesota. So you know, for example, an officer can lose their job, but they can go work for another department because they maintain that license, right? The same way lawyers are licensed, the same way, you know, you got to pass the bar. And so the POST board is the state body that governs that. And the chair of the POST board, Chair McCarthy, we quote her in our report, where she is raising concerns about white supremacy and the need to address it. Furthermore, I've been on panels with her where she explicitly identifies white supremacy as a threat to law enforcement, right? And so we've gotten really good, sort of like a mixed reaction from law enforcement but I would say most of the feedback we've gotten from law enforcement has been positive. And then in the community, people, you know, if you took this report to a Black barbershop, people just kind of look at you like, yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then, but the appreciation is there that we put it together and that we're helping to tell the story. And I'll also just say that our board supported it, which, you never know how governance boards are going to respond when you're like, hey, I want to take out white supremacy. But, we've gotten broad support from our board, from many elected officials. Obviously, Representative Cedric Frazier invited us to testify and offer our preliminary research in support of his bill that would prohibit officers from being associated with white supremacist organizations, which is a common standard for most professions, but not for law enforcement in Minnesota.
So how do you just to your last point there, Justin, how do you begin to identify folks who associate police officers who associate with white supremacist group? I'm sure some of it is overt, but some of it maybe isn't so overt. And so what do you do in those scenarios?
So once again, we don't have data. And so number one is we need to be collecting data. There was a project, and Dr. Cunningham can speak to this more. So where they looked at, 400 departments across the country. Katie, do you want to jump in here and describe that?
I'm finally opening our report so I can stop trying to memorize.
So while you do that, I'll just speak. But number one is we don't have data. We don't know how these things are happening. Everything we know is anecdotal or through media. And the reality is that, I sit at a table with officers once a month to talk about race relations and how we navigate these issues, these uprisings and whatnot. We try to learn from each other and build trust. And when I brought this to them, they were like, yes, this is a problem, right? We know this is a problem. Law enforcement, the FBI has released 3 reports now on how white supremacist organizations target law enforcement and target the military to try to infiltrate. So there's a culture within these groups. There's a reason they dress in military garb, right? These guys go shooting on the weekends. We know that there were officers at the January 6th riot at the Capitol. We know that there was one Minnesota legislator that was there. And we know that, and we know that this is a actual active strategy from white supremacist groups, and so we know that's happening, but we don't have the data to actually map out those patterns. But there was. Did you find the citation in our report?
A team of attorneys actually in Philadelphia who launched a research project called the Plainview Project, and essentially their way to sort of get at this question of we don't have data was to look at social media. So they looked at Facebook posts. And they did a really remarkable and rigorous sort of check to determine who's posting these posts, and it was current and former verified police officers. And so they gathered this collection. You can look it up. It's pretty horrifying, but they've got this increasing and growing collection of Facebook posts, which I think they said there's nearly 3,000 officers from police departments across 6 states who are posting, and they're really highlighting some of the most egregious comments. And so I think it's an example of folks trying to really sort of dig into this question of how do we sort of put some data behind this. But I think it's a very important and tricky question. And I think there's 2 things that I want to point out. The first is that how do we identify those with white supremacist affiliations? It's all of us. So we live in a society in which we are really being inculcated into these views. They may express themselves in really different ways, but I think there's sort of a challenge with trying to just sort of say, we've got to root out white supremacy, so we just got to root out those who are white supremacists. And the problem is this sort of that is a bigger cultural challenge. But I do think that sometimes that's too scary than to do anything about. So I do think that there are really egregious examples of folks engaging in behavior and expressing their ideologies that are overt and racist and horrifying. And at a minimum, we shouldn't allow that. So it's actually not that hard to find. We do background checks for folks with jobs. And so if Representative Frazier's bills go through, there are creative ways, and it probably has to happen at a local level, depending on jurisdiction, to figure out if we're going to hire this person, or if we've already hired this person, they've been on the force for 10 years, what is their association with or connection to or conversation with known white supremacist groups, or rather like what's their, expression of these kinds of beliefs and views and values. And there's really, it's not that hard to figure out, at least overtly. The covert question and the sort of more kind of insidious beliefs of someone who maybe projects themselves as a, oh, I love everybody or whatever, a colorblind, all these sort of other perspectives, but in reality, they sort of harbor deep biases and racist perspectives and views. I think it's certainly trickier. And again, it's going to take this deeper cultural work examining like what policing actually means and looks like. But I also think that I should say we don't have the data, but the FBI does. I mean, there is a lot of data out there that we don't have access to. They've written now several reports that are high level, large and very redacted reports about, I think they use the term ghost skins, about sort of covert operations to really infiltrate, as Justin mentioned, like infiltrate police departments by white supremacist groups. And they've got data on this, so much data that it's a significant concern, but we don't have access to that data as the public, and they're not actually doing anything about it. So I think that there's sort of like, there are several things that need to happen here in order to sort of answer your question. And it's not an obvious, easy way to just sort of say, like, does this person, like, are they a white supremacist, kick them out of the police force? But I think that there are ways, there are actions, there are steps we can do to sort of start this that also are symbolic, right? That show that we actually care about this. And as Justin said, there are so many members of law enforcement who do really care about this and want to take those steps because they really feel that those individuals in particular are harming their profession that they care deeply about. So it's a hard question, but I think that there are ways to begin to tackle it at the very least.
So some of what I'm hearing is maybe one way that we can build trust is to start with some transparency, right? Seeing you have data, we can see some redacted portions, but maybe, hey, let's dig into that and see what's what. Like if put the numbers out there, you're supporting this community cares about what's going on in the police department, and maybe if we knew more about it, some data, we may begin to trust. But is that the first and maybe first step in beginning trust? And should we even the question of trust, should we just be expected to just by virtue of their position, should police be trusted, or is that something that they have to build, and maybe this being more transparent is a way to do that?
So this is actually a really important question. And Katie, I'd be interested to hear what you say about this after some of the talks that you've attended lately. So the issue of trust, we had a conversation with some community members, and one of them was Amber Jones from the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage, who said, you can't actually ask communities of color to trust police, right? Like for communities of color, for immigrant communities, for women in certain circumstances, like to call the police is to take a risk, right? And their circumstances at the moment are so desperate that you have to do that equation. Is it worse for me to call and report the sexual assault and go through the drama and pain and trauma of that? Is it worse for me or for me to keep this to myself? Is it worse for me to call the police in a situation where they could show up and arrest me? I've literally had such situations with friends of mine where the police were called in a situation where their car windows were being smashed out, and they were like, "Hey man, come pick me up." And I was like, "Why? The police are coming." He's like, "Man, if the police come, they're gonna arrest me." And so like these are real things, like these are real equations in real immigrant communities who may not be immigrants who may not be documented have to do this equation, this survival equation around, to engage with law enforcement or not. And to me, that's a complete failure of law enforcement, right? The number one principle of law enforcement should be to keep the people safe, public safety, right? And the reality is that people don't feel safe engaging with law enforcement. They do more harm than they do good in some situations. Look at the situation with George Floyd and Dante Wright. Like, how many different ways could those situations have gone? But they tend to go the way they always have, right? And I think that that builds a different kind of trust, where instead of trusting police to provide the service you want, you trust police to show up and to be a threat and a danger, and it's a risk. And that is, once again, is the failure of the system. And I don't think that we can build trust as the system currently is, because it's steeped in white supremacy, as its legacy in Minnesota specifically of being a state that is home to the largest mass execution in the country, where with the Lakota people at Fort Snelling, we have the history of the lynching in Duluth. And I'll come back to that in a moment. We have a history of sundown towns in Minnesota, where if you're Black and were caught after dark in certain towns around the state, like it was tight for you. And some of those towns still operate that way. And in all these examples, law enforcement is a factor. Coming back to Duluth, the woman who accused Clayton Jackson and McGee of sexually assaulting her, that which resulted in the lynching of those 3 innocent Black men and the incarceration of another innocent Black man who was just issued a pardon, even though it's a posthumous post-mortem pardon, because obviously he's dead now. But the reality is that the nephew, the great nephew of the woman who made those claims against those men that got them killed and incarcerated, is the current police chief of Duluth. Like, we have never reckoned with this. We've been asked to look the other way. And so how can you trust a system of law enforcement that doesn't even have the courage or decency to say, by the way, sorry about that, you know? And in the middle of the uprising that we're having right now, and still sticking to their guns and not wanting to, that's a bad analogy, my apologies, but sticking to old ways of being and not taking advantage of this opportunity to reckon with their history. How do they expect to go forward unless they come clean and start to work with community and redesign who they are, so that we can actually enter into a genuine relationship? Until that happens, it's folks are gonna be in the streets.
Yeah, I think Justin says it perfectly, which is this, and this is the way that I feel as well, is I don't think trust is ever possible with our current system. And so, what it looks like to move forward from here is a super important conversation. How we think about, whether it's sort of like reform is a challenging word, whether we think about abolishing and starting over, like all of these words, carry weight. And I think it's important to continue to engage in these conversations. I think all these perspectives are super important. But I think ultimately, I don't think that in particular communities of color should ever be asked to trust our current system of law enforcement as it stands. But I do think trust is important. And so I think, and this is why I love, the way that Justin leads our organization and the way that the Justice Research Center really tries to operate is sort of around these conversations about values, because we have to think about what matters if we're going to reimagine a system of justice. If we're going to reimagine what law enforcement looks like, we have to understand what our values might be. And I do think trust is an important value. Justin mentioned at the very end too, it's entering into a relationship with someone. And when you engage with someone, when you rely on someone to provide you with support or public safety, you have to have in some way a trusting relationship with that body or that entity or that individual, I believe. And so I think that building trust, keeping trust as an important sort of value is really critical. I'm also not sure it's the place to start. I think I'm glad that Justin mentioned this word relationship, because in order to really have trust, I think there are actually other sort of conversations we need to have about humanity, about dignity, about respect. Like, you actually can't trust someone that you don't believe is human. And so there are deeper, again, like, not to sort of like bring it back to our report, but when we think about this concept of white supremacy, when we think about whiteness and race and racism, and how really like pervasive these challenges are. They're hard because they're big and tricky topics, but the reality is we can't move forward without addressing them because they really connect to how we understand and love. And, you know, it sort of sounds hokey, and it actually sucks that I even have to say that love sounds hokey, but the reality is, like, when we talk about values, it's hard to do so without really coming to a place of deep understanding and empathy and humanity, and sort of trust feels like it can follow from those kinds of conversations. So I do think it's important, and I've had conversations with folks who don't, and you know, everyone has sort of their own perspective, but I also don't think like it's necessarily where we start. I think we have to keep it sort of as our you know, maybe North Star is not the most important thing, but we have to keep it in mind to figure out how do we get there as we reimagine. And then we also have to have sort of harder conversations about how to come to trusting each other.
And maybe we can talk about a bit about the pool of who, you know, who is becoming police officers, right? So we've talked about you know, white supremacy and those types of things. I mean, how do you begin to sort of, you know, understanding all that you all have just said? You know, I think maybe some of it comes down to biases and things like that. And you know, maybe folks would say that maybe some of that is what led to the unfortunate killing of Dante Wright. Is maybe some unconscious biases there that were reared themselves in an ugly way. So how do we, you know, what's next? Like, how do we, you know, should folks be? I know folks are folks in the force have to take tests and things now, but apparently that's not working. And so yeah, maybe where do we go from here? I understand that trust is a part of it, but maybe even an immediate next step.
You know, it's a good question. I feel like there's two parts. It's sort of like the where do we go from here, and sort of like this dynamic of who are officers and their implicit bias and stuff. And so I'll start there. You know, I don't know what went through Kelly Potter's mind when she it's Kelly Potter, is that the former officer's name, right? Okay. I don't know what went through her mind when she shot Dante, right? It did not appear to me that she was acting on some white supremacist sort of like I'm out to kill a black man today sort of mentality. The problem is, you know, and I say this a lot, but there's this African proverb that says, don't look where you landed or where you fell, but look where you slipped. And the reality is that law enforcement, it's a setup. We have a punitive criminal legal system in our country. And often officers just sort of like this warrior mentality, and others have, you know, talked about shifting them to like a guardian mentality and whatnot. But if the mentality is like I'm out looking for, you know, turning traffic stops into criminal investigations, right? When it's just a tail light or tabs or air freshener, right? Like that is the result of a punitive legal system that turns everything into an I'm out to get to you. And that warrior is not even a warrior, he's a predator, right? And so what you see is these situations where officers are showing up like predators. And that's why this former officer Potter is in a situation where, you know, a simple mistake or muscle memory or bias or whatever it may be results in the death of a black man who I think the total of his warrants is like $300. And you know, like this is ridiculous. That's the cost of a black life, and that's on the high end. George Floyd was $20, right? And I think that we have to really start looking at the setup. There's other types of justice. So there's punitive justice where you focus on punishing people who break the law, right? Well, there's restorative justice where you recognize harm and you try to repair that harm, right? What we try to focus on, and we're still new with this concept, is at the Minnesota Justice Research Center, is transformative justice. You know, I believe that like when harm happens in community, you know, on the other side of that harm in a process of repair, things should be different, right? Things should be better, right? We should work to make sure things are better on the other side of whatever the incident may be. And currently what we do is, you know, if you picture the justice scales, our current response in the punitive system is to cut off one of those scales and put it in a box somewhere. And we're not recognizing that by doing that, the scale of justice is broken now and is dysfunctional. And so I think that the officers are set up to have these kind of interactions. They're set up to have to make split-second decisions. They're set up to treat everything as a criminal investigation. And frankly, like it's amazing to me how traffic stops are like used to, like, you know, they're looking for drugs and warrants and all these things, right? But when your house gets robbed, they show up and give you a blue card and they're like, okay, call us if you hear anything, right? And it's just a failure on the system's response because it's just looking for the action. And that is not a warrior, that is not, you know, an officer, that is a predator type mentality. Like, where's the action at? To your second point about forgive me, I kind of got distracted.
Where do we go?
Where we go from here? Yeah. So transitions theory, you know, is something that I learned years ago, and it's this idea that, you know, in a transition, you know, you start from a position of mastery, like you think you know what's going on, you got a grip on everything, and then there's an incident or something that causes just straight chaos. Everything is tense and things are messy and sloppy and systems are being undone or reinforced in the fight to undo them. And as you move through that chaos and that tension, as long as you keep moving, you will get to a place of mastery again, right? But you can't see it until you get through it. And that is the cycle that I hope that we are in right now. That the tension and the chaos that we're experiencing right now is just about us moving closer to the world we want to live in. And I am so thankful for the folks on this call who are trying to find a way to support more diversity within the legal field. And I'm so thankful, even more so, to the young, brilliant Black organizers who have been holding it down for the last 10 years, trying to make our country a better place and demanding that people say the names of folks we've lost, demanding that people say that Black Lives Matter as a counter narrative to the insidious white supremacy that is infested in everything and in the ether. I'm so thankful for the folks who are in the streets. And no, I don't support looting and rioting and all of that stuff, you know, but at the same time, I understand. And I am thankful that those folks are out there in the streets, I want everyone to be safe. But you know, the reality is that they didn't listen when we showed up with petitions. They didn't listen when we showed up with policy. They didn't listen when we tried to do civilian oversight. They didn't listen. And every step of the way, they've had years to work with us. And the fact that they are worried about another police building burning down right now, the fact that may encourage them to listen and be able to move in the right direction, like, I'm okay with that outcome. And in the process, I hope everyone stays safe.
I'll just add, I think whenever Justin uses a really great metaphor, I just want to run with it. So I'm going to go to the scales because I really like that. And I'm a former high school science teacher. And so I think about this idea of scales. Like, if I was teaching science and you keep putting, you know, one little rock in one side and the other, and you can't get it to even out. You don't just keep sort of putting rocks and watching it tip, or you don't chop one off. Like, there are two options, essentially. We either zero it out if it's an electric balance, right? We got to literally zero it out, or we have to throw it away because it's broken and we have to get a new scale, right? So, like, the reality is, like, tinkering is important, and you know, or, you know, maybe we sort of blow it up. If we have a fire extinguisher ready, then, like, maybe that's the best way to start fresh. Like, I think that we have to have these bigger conversations about where, you know, where we need to go from here to sort of think about that question. But I do think that conversations are really important. Like and maybe this is the teacher in me, but I think there's so much learning that needs to be done. There's so much unlearning that needs to be done. And so we have to talk about these issues. We have to call them by their name. We have to understand what white supremacy is. And it's really complicated in some ways. And so I think, where do we go from here? We just have to keep going forward, and we have to sort of bounce off the walls and however that looks, but we have to try something that to me feels more sort of dramatic in many ways. And whether it's just zeroing it out and keeping the sort of bare bones of the scale, maybe, or whether it's like throwing it out and starting fresh, like I think that's an important conversation, but we have to have that conversation. So I'm hopeful that it seems like you guys have a really great base of support and followers, and I've watched all the other wild conversations. And so you all are doing really important work and bringing together community organizations to do that. So we're really grateful to be a part of it. And I'm excited to continue to engage with you guys moving forward.
Yeah, well, we're unfortunately at time, but I wanted to. This has been a real joy for me, and I too am looking very much forward to continuing to see how we can work together and be supportive of one another in the work that we're doing. It's important, and we keep getting reminders of why it's important. So I thank you all again for the time. I know that we'll be sharing some additional resources. I think we'll link with the video that you all have. We'll share the report for folks to look at, and we'll also share ways to get involved with the Minnesota Justice Research Center. So thank you all, Justin and Katie, so very much for the time and the work that you're doing. Keep it up, and we're really looking forward to working with you all soon. And thanks to everyone who came to listen to the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks. Thank you all. Take care. Have a great one.